today we're going to talk about how that all unfolded and how it could continue to bring revenue for as an alternative for jurisdictions that might be considering esports now as an activity. So hopping right into it, let's start with the probably one of the most important pieces to begin with in terms of regulated gaming is the regulators. So we'd love to hear from Chris and how the Isle of Man looks at esports, and how is it different? Is it seen different from regular sports? Is it seen the same? How the regulations done, and how does licensing occur, and all those good things. Chris.
Thank you very much. Just to sort of caveat, I mean, I'm work from the digital agency, so it's I work closely with my colleagues in the GSC from the regulator side, and I was taken on in August from an esports background to basically support and look from a regulation side. Should we look to craft an esports specific regulation for the things outside betting? But from a betting side, to answer your questions, I mean, looking at what the Isle of Man has been doing. We've been regulating esports betting for some time now. As you said, there was a lot of guys on your side of the pond that had a quick and some would say knee-jerk kind of reaction based on the COVID side of things. I mean, the Isle of Man has been, if you look at some of the biggest and most successful esports betting outfits in the world, you've got Lookbox, Rivalry, Unicorn, they all hold Isle of Man licenses. And from my time with my colleagues in the regulatory side of things, there are some aspects, and this is what I'm hoping we can unpick during this panel. There are a lot of aspects which are very similar to sports, and people from outside the esports space, it might be quite alien to them. But as we've talked offline as well, esports has a number of similarities based on existing sports. You still have win-losses, you still have teams, you still have the risks associated, whether or not it's a tennis game or a football game. So what we've done is, over the last sort of couple of years, we've really focused on looking at what we've been extremely good at doing on licensing things outside of esports, and applied those processes, checks and balances to this industry that maybe others have been looking to catch up on. I don't know if that answers some of your questions, but I'd love to sort of dive in and hear from the rest of the panel on with regards to the differences between traditional sports and esports, and maybe I can add a bit more context around that answer.
Excellent, thank you, Chris. Marco, from Pinnacle's point of view, Pinnacle has always been, for several years now, been the largest in terms of volume for esports, one of the first to enter the esports market with a team that is familiar with esports and dare I say endemic to esports. How have you guys seen the traffic, and is there any truth to the fact that esports was the biggest game in town for 2020?
Esports was not the biggest game in town for 2020 in the whole. But to be fair, it was the biggest game during the pandemic by quite during the main months, from March to July, right? And given that it was mainly the only thing that played, and then later on you had these crazy Belarus soccer and African soccer adding, but esports has always been very big for us, so obviously, like, for us in that regard, the pandemic was positive for esports. As bad as it is for the world, it was positive for esports. It also allowed the entire company to focus on esports, which was kind of fun, right? Normally we have to split our resources around the 30 different sports that we offer. Now everybody had only one job, which is to make the esports product better. So for us, in that regard, it was quite a positive thing. On the that's basically my comment to that, I think.
Yeah, that's excellent. So from the so Michael, how does your experiences differ from that as a slightly newer entry into esports, although you guys have been around for a few years? How's your perspective?
Yeah, I think Marco mentioned something there that touched on it, was the ability to focus on esports. And I suppose the difference in a company like ours compared to maybe some of the bigger sports operators is the amount of attention and care that goes towards an esports product. And I think pre-pandemic, for a lot of big companies, esports was something still relatively new. It wasn't a big part of their book. You know, they hadn't given the attention to it that Pinnacle had for the length of time. Suddenly, you know, I know some traders from top tier 1 esports teams and tier 1 operators, and I suppose they were a little bit off in the corner before, and the sports traders didn't really understand what they were doing or understand what they were looking at, and suddenly they became the heroes, you know, from March onwards. And I think that sort of changed the attitude of management and decision makers in these bigger companies that maybe hadn't given that sort of attention to it before. That will permanently change it, I think, not just because of ongoing uncertainty, but it brought, you know, the pandemic brought esports to front pages around the world, you know, and people who hadn't really previously been aware of it saw all sorts of concurrent player records and increases on Twitch, and so from our point of view of being an esports first company, it's something that we always could put all our resources towards. And I think that's sort of the difference between a smaller esports first company and maybe a larger operator that hadn't previously given that attention towards it.
So thank you, Michael. Now let's take a look at, you know, in terms of regulations for any of the jurisdictions that, you know, and any of you online today listening to us, if you're part of a regulatory body or if you're a company looking into getting into esports, you know, from the academic side, Brett, you know, how do you see the challenges that could potentially face regulators in looking at esports? Are there anything that's unique that they need to look at that kind of makes esports a different challenge from just, you know, licensing a soccer game or licensing football or basketball?
I think the biggest thing, and this tends to come up whether we're talking about regulation or not, and Michael already touched on it, is the knowledge base. I think that there's a huge amount of understanding that isn't present, and it's not because these people are idiots. It's just because there hasn't necessarily been that sort of exposure to esports, whether that be as a general trading product or, and before this, I asked Roger if he wanted me to stick to just esports or also talk about games as well. And I will stick to esports, but I will note that when I talk about these sorts of education things, I think you're often going to find, definitely in the regulatory world, the general public, often even sometimes with operators themselves, with some of my fellow academics, there tends to be this kind of umbrella term of esports used to include everything that could potentially mean. It could be esports, it could be video games themselves, it could be betting within video games, it could be skins. There's just a huge variety of different subjects that tend to fall under this general term, even though perhaps the folks on this session understand esports as just the competitive video gaming, these events that we're able to set up for an equivalent to sports betting. And I think that's the biggest thing that tends to come up when it comes to setting up a framework that both recognizes what already exists and is dynamic enough to change as esports changes. And I think the introduction that we've already been through shows just how quickly that can change. I don't want to be too much of a brown noser here, but I do want to point out that Isle of Man has been particularly nimble at this sort of thing, and not just with esports. In many ways, Isle of Man has been set up to prepare itself for regulation of esports through some of the things it's already done in the past. It set up the potential regulation of skins betting going back several years now, while other regulators are still trying to even figure out whether or not that's something that should be regulated. The ability to bring in new forms of technology and currency already exists in Isle of Man because the Gambling Commission has already worked with their their financial ministry to figure out ways to accept cryptocurrency as a means of wagering. So just as an example, here in Nevada, I think it was 4 days ago that IGT officially got its Bitcoin patent to allow for cryptocurrencies to be used on bricks and mortar gaming. So that sort of shows kind of how Isle of Man is set up to be able to move forward with these sorts of things. And I think that that's the kind of thing where other regulators can learn, not necessarily to emulate their specific regulations, but certainly to see how these sorts of things might exist.
If I can jump in there and just obviously.
Sure, Chris, go ahead, please.
Super thanks to Brett there. I'll be sure to make sure that if anybody is not on this call to pass on those kind words. But you hit the nail on the head there, Brett. But I think one of the things, and again, I don't want this to be totally focused on the Isle of Man, but I'd like other jurisdictions and other entries to learn from this. Is what we did quite early on was we were very aware, and it helps that one of our regulators is a massive esports fan. He's a big Magic the Gathering fan, and he understood the industry very well. But we didn't just look internally. We ran workshops. We've got continuous groups and looking at whether or not it's data centers like the Continent 8 guys, that's CSPs, it's law firms, and getting these guys together. And we can do that on an island. It's quite easy to be able to get people around the table and look at not only what the existing pain points are, but what's coming around the side. But just to expand on something that you said outside of the Isle of Man, Brett, and I'd love to unpick this, is one of my favorite topics, is the biggest challenge for anybody looking at whether or not it's regulating esports, is getting involved in esports, is esports as an industry is constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. If you look at esports orgs that have been around for sort of the last 20 years, even themselves trying to define what esports is, taking on new games, taking on new content creators, new games hit the market, and they'll create players for them, but they won't necessarily be classified as strictly esports. But for somebody outside in, looking at that, it can be such a challenge, and the esports industry as a whole doesn't make it easy for people to get involved, because it even has a challenge defining itself. What is esports?
To piggyback on that as well, just for our viewers that aren't as aware, dealing with esports and any sort of regulation is dealing with almost two completely opposing forces in terms of time. Esports is so rapidly moving. So for instance, like even when I started my law practice and operating within strictly esports back in 2015, we would say that there was about industry turnover about every 3 months. So that means that about every 3 months, there would be some seismic shift within the space that would fundamentally alter how we would have to either contract around things or account for certain things that have now been significantly different. Compare and contrast that with what it would take to actually create a regulatory system. You're constantly in a state of catch-up. And you're in a state of catch-up in a place where, as Brett noted, you already have you're already operating from a significant knowledge deficit. So you're, in a sense, drowning and trying to climb up for air at all times. That said, obviously it can be done. And I think, one of the things we're highlighting here is certainly how, Isle of Man is doing that quite well. I can tell you, for certain in the States, even just based on our regulatory system at large, it's messy. We're dealing with 50 different sets of laws, one per state, and then your federal law on top of that. So it's entirely this hodgepodge. Certainly compliance is a nightmare in trying to operate any platform within the country that would be, somewhat even state to state. I'm based out of New York. I'm very close to New Jersey, which High is based out of. And even just a quick trip over the bridge, and all of a sudden, I can bet on my phone on a baseball game or a basketball game or a football game. Can't do that in New York. hopefully soon. But certainly these are the kind of things that, certainly on the state side, there's an immense challenge, even just at the sports level, to be able to get these regulations passed, and certainly in a cohesive way, even more so. And then even kind of once we get past that hurdle, it's then the additional hurdle of, okay, now we need to explain to all these people what esports is. And then continue to explain it to them what esports is and all of the different variations involved.
And that, those are all very key points, especially if you're a regulator and you're looking at, or consulting to a regulator or working on the regulation side of it, understanding what esports really is. And, like Brett said, esports is really a collective term. So, there's so many different games. There are new games being introduced. How do you ensure that, and there are tournaments all over the place, and, whether is this a legit tournament? Is it not a legit tournament? Are the rules being followed? All these things require a certain amount of knowledge. And that is, and that's already assuming what esports, betting on esports really encompasses. Where the confusion really starts coming in is like what Brett has said, people start confusing esports with things like loot boxes. They start confusing esports with things like skin betting as a form of currency. And that just totally, off base, and it confuses the entire issue. Now, just to touch on that a little bit, now, if, what would you guys say, maybe, either Roger or Brett, or maybe even Chris, what's a good resource, for a regulator or somebody who's consulting to a regulation body? Where should they start? How do they get started? Can they reach out to, a jurisdiction like the Isle of Man and see if they can learn something from them? Or, are there some resources out there that they're able to work with? Anybody?
Well,
I mean, I don't mind jumping in, but go on, Brett.
Go ahead, Chris.
I'd say, obviously, I'm going to say that you can definitely pick up the phone and speak to me or my colleagues on the Isle of Man. But ultimately, is two things, and is not be afraid, because as Roger has said, that the esports industry is so fast moving, and trying to put a pin in something like that can be quite daunting. But ultimately, as I say, not just out in the regulatory conversations, is not be afraid to play some games, and whether or not that's, if you're a consultant or you're a regulator, or just a betting operator, trying to bring on some new products, is actually play the games. And I'm not saying that you need to grind and you need to become a master at anything, but just, as with anything that whether or not it's a new sport that comes around that isn't in the esports space, is not being afraid to actually dive in. I think there's still this fear from some decision makers that they'll catch geek, that they'll if they've got this fear of playing the games or having conversations, jumping on a Twitch stream, because it's so alien to them. But having seen people that once they get over that hurdle, and they realize, well, actually, I can jump on Discord and start playing some games with people. The knowledge base is quite quickly, I feel. I don't know if you have a different opinion, guys, but once people actually get over that fear and get involved, then they can surround themselves and they can have conversations with people that can help them learn.
I think that's a great point, and it's a good time, I think, for me to bring this also again, temporarily to the operator side of the equation. One of the things that's always been said, from ever since Pinnacle started doing esports, is Pinnacle's success is attributed to the fact that they have a crew in the company that's endemic players. They know esports, they play the games. They know what tournaments are there. They know what tournaments are good. They know what games are good. They understand the odds. They understand the players. Marco, would you, what is that the magic formula there that allows Pinnacle to succeed, where other, I would say, more broader, maybe even longer established sports books have failed trying to get into esports?
That certainly played a major role in it. I mean, the combination of that with the first mover advantage, probably led to where we are right now. I mean, most bookmakers probably haven't really heard about esports maybe until the 2017, 2018 time, and then obviously COVID accelerated the need for esports with all the bookmakers. We've seen a few other bookmakers, incorporating esports very successfully into an existing offering. And then we see a lot of endemic esports brands. That's a little bit the landscape that we have. But it would have been impossible to get esports going without people actually who care about esports and who like to watch esports themselves. I mean, when we talk about offering esports in 2010, we talked about maybe a weekly turnover of a few $100s, right? You don't get to pay the bills with that. So if it's not a passion project, why continuing it? But from 2010 to now, obviously the growth of esports has been phenomenal, and in many ways we were fortunate that the Justin TVs or Twitches of the world existed, and that the tournaments gotten bigger, and that everything happened in parallel, right? And we just happened to be there at the right time, and when people were looking to place a wager, right, there were literally only maybe like 3 bookmakers in the world who had esports odds, and we were one of the most well-established bookmakers, and regulated bookmakers and official bookmakers, and so a lot of people flocked to us and stayed with us.
That's great, Marco. That it definitely plays a very big role in terms of getting the understanding. And I think one of the biggest barriers is always understanding it to begin with, and and when you don't understand, you're flying blind for sure. Now, Michael, your company and your groups before all the mergers and all that were essentially endemic, built from the ground up esports. How do you see, were there any initial resistance when you guys hit the market and you're trying to get regulated in different jurisdictions? What are some of the obstacles that you see, and what are some of the lessons that perhaps you can let regulators here that might be tuning in know to avoid?
Well, in terms of going back a little bit to the start of the company, I've been with Ascot for 1.5 years, so I can't really comment on exactly what was happening there. But I think to echo sort of what's been discussed in the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes, it's about knowledge, and I think even beyond esports, regulation in general. There are regulations that are created, and you get the sense that there's not that knowledge of the subject from the people creating them at times, and there have been a few cases over the last few years of countries that introduce regulation for the first time and maybe don't get it exactly right straight away. I think Roger was talking about the US market and the complexities of that, and state laws and federal laws, and that's very much something that we're approaching now in terms of the US market, and it is complex and there's a lot to navigate. But I think I think the pandemic having brought it more to the fore, esports, and made it something that the operators and regulators are having to look at. I think there's definitely that motivation now for people to get it right, and ultimately regulators will get it right, but it's very fast moving, it's very changeable, and it might take some a little more time than others. Isle of Man's get plenty of shout outs during this panel, and that's because they put the attention to it earlier. So I think things just take a little bit of time for ourselves. In terms of we haven't we're licensed in a few different jurisdictions. We haven't come up against any specific barriers. One thing maybe that was mentioned is to do with skins. There are elements of esport that esports fans would maybe want in a product that might not always be possible, and so you have to sort of hold back a little bit of some of the things you might want to do with your product because it doesn't meet regulation. So I think for operators, understanding what they can and can't do, I suppose, is the main thing.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And actually, now I would like to bring up one of the questions because I think it falls in quite well. I think we have a question from the audience, from Paul Johnson, and he was asking, if I paraphrase, essentially concerns about integrity in esports. I'll start that off a little bit first, putting on my hat as the integrity ambassador of the Esports Integrity Commission. Integrity in esports is actually, really not that much different from traditional sports. So if you go to a league, which is a tier 1 league or a class A league that's playing, with their tournaments and rules and whatnot, monitoring is actually, happening at quite a high level. There, if you look at ESL tournaments and whatnot, a lot of things do happen. Players, there are monitoring equipment. The equipment being played on are all sanitized. There are no cheats, hacks allowed. They are monitored. Players coming on board not allowed to carry any equipment with them that may contain viruses or may contain, things like aimbots or tools that might help their game. In fact, with some of the major tournaments, there's even drug testing involved with the players to make sure that they're not taking any performance enhancing drugs. So, and in that aspect, the other thing that should be noted, if you're not familiar with esports, because video games are all happening in the digital domain, everything that happens in a game is recorded. There is a log of everything. And, just to give an example, sometime in 2020, there was an exploit that was discovered in the game Counter-Strike, where coaches were essentially viewing spectator cams and being able to see where the opponent's teams are, and they were feeding the information back to the players. The moment, in terms of an event, that you can compare that almost the same situation as in Major League Baseball when they were using cameras to pick up the signs that the opposing teams were using, or even in football where the New England Patriots at one point was accused of videotaping practice sessions and getting their playbooks and being able to send that to the and use that as an advantage. Now in traditional sports, when you catch something like that happen, it's kind of hard. It's almost impossible to roll back the clock to figure out how long that has been done, and whether it's prevalent and whether it's still continuing. But with esports, you actually could. And with that specific CS:GO thing, ESIC actually went back to logs, for several months, and actually, ended up finding incursions of that exploit happening in the past, and handed out punishment to players coaches that got banned as a result. But from the practical aspect, maybe Chris, you can jump in and see what do you guys do as a regulatory body to ensure integrity? Because clearly, in sportsbook, integrity is key.
Well, thankfully, mentioning ESIC there, the Alaman government is one of the initial founding members of ESIC. So working closely with Ian and his colleagues and acting fast on information that we receive, and making sure that those that are licensed, they have access to that information as well. But again, it comes back around to understanding. It comes back around to if we're receiving information and whether or not it is like CoachGate, the CS coaching scandal, or accusations of screen sniping, or instances in lobbies. It all comes back around to understanding and ensuring that within our regulatory team that we have individuals that aren't playing catch up, that have their finger on the pulse on what actually is happening in the space. Because sometimes you have to understand different terminology that's being used not just within esports, but per scene as well, within different games. And some of the language and the actions that may happen in the Counter-Strike scene can be very different than what goes on in a MOBA. So I think to sort of answer your question, from an integrity point of view, it is working with the likes of ESIG, but it's also ensuring that we understand and we can speak the same language.
I think one of the real important things to involving, what can game producers or publishers do to eliminate hacking from lobbies is simply protecting their IP. So earlier this week, we had a lawsuit filed, I believe, by Activision as well as Riot Games. I believe it was Activision, yeah, on behalf of, or rather against a company that was producing in-game hacks and selling them. Basically, you have actions like that to, as a means of just discouraging bad actors in the future. The punishments will be severe, especially considering the fact that, hacking and selling hacks is clearly against the end user license agreement. It's clearly IP infringement in terms of, creating unlawful derivative works of the intellectual property involved. And the fact that they were selling these hacks also means that they were enriching themselves based on all of the above.
Cheating.
So, these types of things happen all the time. Activision Blizzard tends to be very, very active in pursuing hackers, especially. But you do have some other companies that do it as well. And, stamping out these types of lawsuits are designed to make an example out of the bad actors so that, you really can discourage the next company that decides to try and be so enterprising as to produce these hacks down the line of thinking twice.
Great. Yeah, there's also a question that's asking about, and I'm going to combine a couple of questions. One is gender, and the other one is age. Interestingly, esports is probably one of the most inclusive and kind of mixed environment out there. There really aren't any tournaments that have any gender restrictions in terms of whether it's in all women's or in all men's. There are very little restrictions there, and even in terms of age, you can have a team that has a player that is very young and a team that, and the same team have a player that's much older. There are no age brackets, there are no weight classes, there are no gender classes in a lot of these tournaments. If you're a game, you qualify to go in, you qualify and you're there. So that's one of the aspects. But back to the integrity issue, like I know Chris had mentioned working with ESIC. I believe, and Brett, you might be able to jump in to verify that as well. The Nevada Gaming Commission also works with ESIC in terms of the integrity part.
Yes, the Nevada Gaming Control Board has an MOU with ESIC.
And in terms of esports betting, Nevada has been legal since 2018.
I believe it's 2017. The first
17, right? I think World 17 was the first bet that was taken. So there are several jurisdictions that do allow it. I think when Nevada started allowing, it was on a case-by-case basis. The bookmakers had to get a special clearance on each of the tournaments, and with the MOU with ESIC, basically the tournament had to be an ESIC approved event for that to go through. I think that's one of the key things that regulators should look at, working with a body such as ESIC that is able to help them navigate through the different games, the different leagues, the different rules involved, and monitor and get to know what is right and what is wrong, and what is safe and what is not. We are close to running out of time, so let's start wrapping up, maybe with some last words. Let's start with Michael, since we ended with Michael in the introduction. Let's start, Michael, in terms of what would you say, in terms both sides, what would you tell regulators in terms of looking at esports as an option, as a real option in terms of economic resiliency in situations such as the pandemic? And what would you say to operators looking at the same situation from the other side of the equation?
Well, I think for anything with regulation, it's know your subject and know what you're looking at. I think when you're talking about pandemic, I mean, one of the issues that or the concerns, I suppose, when the pandemic comes up and there's so much focus towards esports is, comes around responsible gaming and affordability and operators driving traffic towards product those customers wouldn't normally bet on, and there's definitely been some concerns of about that from different sort of licensing bodies as well. I think from in terms of for operators, it's again, so I suppose it's just knowledge both ways. For the regulators, it's known with the product and what they're regulating, and the intricacies of that, and from operators, it's knowing the regulations and understanding them, and knowing where the lines are, and as long as you stay within them, you can be creative within that.
Thank you, Michael. Marco, same question.
Let's keep it going. I mean, I don't envy the regulators when they have to have a look at esports, right? I think there's a few things that the regulators sometimes, you don't have to regulate all of esports immediately, right? I mean, esports is a very broad area, right? I mean, and if you think about it from a betting perspective, nothing else matters except for the top three, right? So, let's focus on the top three: Dota, League of Legends, Counter-Strike, and stop worrying so much about regulating Rocket League or, whatever all the other things are. From an operator point of view, it's okay. It can come when it can come. We like to offer our Counter-Strike, our Dota, our League of Legends, and so if we can focus our regulatory efforts on those three, that's good. The other thing is, as much as you would like to regulate all of soccer the same way, there's a difference between regulating the Barclays Premier League and German 7th division soccer, right? I mean, they might follow a similar framework, but the importance for the operators, once again, is very much on the top end of the thing. That meaning, if you regulate the ESLs and the DreamHacks and all the big ones, and then you go down the list, you make your life a little bit easier. I often feel that many of the jurisdictions try to really take it on at once. When I'm hearing loot boxes and skin betting, and for many of these operators, these are fringe things that exist in the ecosystem. Obviously, but if I had my way, I would just forbid them at the first place, regulate what is important, and then slowly start working my way through it.
I think that's a very good point, Marco, in terms of don't bite off more than you can chew. The interesting thing, again, it's important to know that while we call it esports, it's actually so many different games. League of Legends is one self-contained game itself. CS:GO is another one. Dota is another one. Those are the top three. So even if you just start with League, it's a start. It's a way to build. And if you start with just and League is probably arguably probably the safest, because everything is running under Riot's control. There's just one league and one tournament schedule, one worldwide tournament bracket to deal with. And there was a question earlier about in terms of whether Macau is looking at this. I mean, part of the reason why we're having this is to see if there's if the Macanese government will be interested in looking at this, and potentially this could inform. But very similarly, Macau takes a quite a similar, if I'm not wrong, quite a similar approach to even traditional sports. It's their sports books aren't open to all sports; they're open to specific sporting events only. So in that same model, they could easily say, learn about one particular game, say League, find out the intricacies of it, regulate it well, and that would totally minimize, and I would say arguably, the risk would be no different from NBA. Chris, same question to you.
Thank you. Yeah, same question and same answers as the guys, really. Not to sort of echo too much, but there's a word that I use an awful lot, and it's on I suppose a ban regulated list in our office for me not to use it so much. But the word is authenticity. I drop the word authenticity so much, but it's so true within esports, and whether or not it's guys like Marco. With at the core within his business, he has authentic. I think you mentioned, Marco, passion and understanding of the game and the esports. So authenticity is so important, and whether or not that's if you're working with a regulator like in the Isle of Man, I've spent a lot of time with law firms, corporate service providers, data center providers, and finding that authenticity to want to bolster and support and help ultimately their clients grow in this new exciting industry. And they're coming at it with authenticity, authentic knowledge of this industry, but also a passion to support you. And yeah, and like Marcus says as well, I mean, the focus is not to try and do too much. You focus on the core three, because as we've talked about in this session, there's so many new games that come along, and don't worry that I've got to offer odds on an Among Us title. You know, Among Us is here, everybody's talking about it. I don't know, my kids play it, but is that something that I can offer odds on? Don't panic on that. Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, same question, but same answers really.
Brett, how would you look at this particular challenge from the academic side? And, you know, maybe even if you're able to comment on concerns about responsible gaming and, you know, potential minor gaming in terms of gamings, because, you know, video games,
yeah,
right?
Actually, the first thing I was going to say was to give props to Michael for commenting on responsible gaming. Usually on these panels, I'm the one bringing that up, and then, you know, everyone goes, oh yeah, okay, great, we'll move on to the next subject. And so thank you. It's really refreshing to see that it's. I'm actually going to go a slightly different direction from the others, so as to not close out with that. And I agree with everybody else. I do largely. I think that the other perspective to keep in mind is the same lesson that the operators are taking, which is KYC. I think that regulators also need to know their customer, because we're talking about, from both of these perspectives, from operators, from regulators, it's about sustainability. It's just how we define sustainability is a little bit different if you're a business operator versus a regulator. And when we talk about some of these regulators, it's also what is the group that you regulate, these citizens, or just in general, it might not be just citizens, it might be others all around the world who use the products, who are licensed in your jurisdiction. What is it that they're interested in? I know this is the Asia Esports Forum, is that right? Esports Connect Asia Virtual Forum, get the name right there. And some of the games that we've talked about, these big three, are somewhat universal, but there's others as well that you may want to be interested in. Mobile esports, for example, are particularly prevalent in Southeast Asia and draw quite a lot of betting dollars in a way that, for example, here in Nevada and the Isle of Man, to use our other example here, they simply aren't as popular. And so it's not necessarily something that, say, the Nevada Control Board should be pushing up to the top of its priority list. But a gambling regulator in Asia should definitely be looking into mobile sports. Kings of Glory, for example, is one that has particularly grown in the last year, especially during the pandemic. And so that's very important as well. And then this also applies to things like integrity and understanding what it is the consumer is interested in, what the consumer particularly values, because that's, of course, who the regulator is protecting. So it's not just a matter of preventing hacks to allow for people to cheat to get into this first place spot, whatever it is in that competition. It's also about the cheating involved in losing, and, for example, match fixing, and how the community views that. I won't go too deep down that rabbit hole. I know we're about to end here, but there's some research that we did a few years ago. Please reach out. I'm happy to talk about it. That saw how the community abhors cheating to win, this idea that you would push somebody out to be able to get that first place spot, but treats this cheating to lose concept with an almost indifference. It doesn't really matter because the person who's trying so hard is winning. And so it doesn't matter, even though from our perspective, we recognize immediately the integrity of the game is compromised. The betting market is compromised when that sort of thing happens. So, you know, to walk a mile in the shoes of the consumer as well, I think is particularly important for regulators, and not just for, you know, these lessons that we're constantly talking about with operators.
Great. Thanks, Brett. Well, we've come to the end of this panel, and I'd like to extend my thanks to Dr. Brett Barbernell, Chris Kisek, Marco Bloom, Michael Keown, and, you know, to all the attendees, feel free to reach out to the speakers. You know, there's an immense amount of knowledge here, both from the regulatory side, the operator side, the academic side, on all aspects of, you know, everything from how to regulate responsible gaming to how to operate. So please, reach out to them and with any questions that you may have after this conference, and feel free to stay in touch with everybody.